What's up, it's Ben. Today I'm going to show you how to take your camera out of auto mode. That was easy, right? I'm just kidding. I know that you want to learn how to use your camera to its fullest capabilities and not just in auto mode. So why do you even want to take your camera out of auto mode? Well, that's a fair question. Auto mode makes things pretty easy. But if you want to have a little more control and take photos like these, then it's best to have the fullest control of your camera. In auto mode, there's a little computer inside of your camera that decides what is properly exposed, where your highlights should be, where your shadows should be, depending on what mode you're in. Once it's decided the proper exposure, your camera will then go through and change all the settings to match that exposure, your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO. So before we get into the knowledge of how to change your camera there, let's talk a little bit about those things. The three main things that make up the brightness of an image are your shutter speed, your ISO, and your aperture. Aperture is the opening of the lens. So how much light is let in through the lens. It controls a couple of things. The first thing is how much light you're letting into your lens. It's kind of like the pupil in your eye. So the wider it gets, the more light that comes in. That's usually in a dark circumstance. Think about if you're in a dark room, your pupils dilate to let more light in. The aperture is the same thing on the lens. In addition to that, the more the aperture opens up and dilates, the more light that comes in, also the more depth you get in your image. Meaning, if I come really close to the camera here, my background is going to blur. That's because I'm wide open on my lens. I'm at an f2.8. So the smaller the number, the bigger the aperture, the more depth you perceive in your image, and also the more light that comes in. Aperture is usually notated on your camera as an f-stop. It'll be the one in the menu that says F with a number next to it. The smaller the number, the wider the aperture, the more light you get. The larger the number, the smaller the aperture, the less light you get. So this is what an aperture ring looks like on a lens. Sometimes it'll just be in the camera, sometimes you'll get a lens where it's adjustable like this on the lens. You can see this lens goes from a 2 all the way to a 16. And what's happening is when I'm at a 16, the aperture is really small like that. But if I open it all the way up to an f2, then the opening's a lot bigger. There are little blades inside that are controlling the aperture and the size of the aperture. When you have a really small aperture, the number will be higher on your lens. You'll get less light and you'll be able to see much more in your image. The mountains in the background will be really in focus, as well as the person you're taking the image of. Here's an image with a really shallow depth of field. This means that the aperture is pretty wide open, probably at an f2.8, maybe an f2. Notice the depth in the image. Notice how you see your subject in focus and the background totally falls out of focus. One thing you might notice is your aperture might change depending on the length of your lens. So a wide lens, wide open, at an f2.8, still might not look like it has as much depth as a really long lens at an f5.6. I think it's important to note that there's a balance in choosing your aperture. If you're shooting a portrait of somebody, the appeal of having a really shallow depth of field with your subject in focus and the background totally falling off is appealing. But sometimes you don't want to have just the tip of the nose in focus and the eyes out of focus. So finding a balance of where I can get my whole face in focus or the whole subject in focus and then letting the background fall off is ideal. Not only is aperture used to affect the brightness of an image, but it also affects your composition. So if you want to have something that's close and in focus and the background's out of focus, then you open up your aperture and you have a lower number. Or if you want everything to be in focus, if you're taking a group photo of a lot of people, or you're taking a photo of somebody and you want the background to be in focus also, then you close down your aperture, you have a higher number, and you have to compensate for light elsewhere. One of those places you can compensate for light is your shutter speed. Shutter speed is how quickly your shutter in your camera will open and close. Shutter speed on your camera is going to look like a fraction. It's going to say something like 1/60 or 1/250. Sometimes it's just a number. It'll have shutter speed next to it. The number indicates how quickly your shutter is going to open and close. A faster shutter, the larger the number, 1/250, 1/500, maybe even 1/1000, is going to freeze a moment in time. It's great for something like sports or action if you're on the streets and you want to capture a specific moment very quickly. A fast shutter speed is vital. The other side of that is a slow shutter, something like 1/30, 1/8, maybe even a full second. This means that your shutter will fire and it'll stay open and allow light to come in for a full second or an eighth of a second, and then it'll shut. So think about it this way. While your shutter's open and you're letting all the light in, anything that's happening in your frame is going to be recorded in your image. Having the shutter open for an extended period of time can give you something cool called motion blur. This is when an object is moving across your frame while your shutter is open. Something like this. The faster the shutter, the more frozen your image will be. Think about somebody running across your frame and they're paused in a moment of time. Whereas if you have a slow shutter and you shoot the same subject running across your frame, then as your shutter opens and closes, that person continues to move, they might look like a blurry object in your image. Sometimes this is cool for style. But if you're shooting something like sports where you need to capture that moment in a very crisp way, then a fast shutter is going to be vital. Okay, so besides compositionally, why would you have a fast shutter or slow shutter? That's another good question. So a slow shutter will open and be open for a longer period of time, and it'll let a lot of light in. Inversely, a very fast shutter, something like 1,000th of a second, is so quick that it just lets a very little bit of light in, but again is great for capturing a specific frozen moment in time. So in addition to aperture, your shutter speed will also affect your brightness of your image, but it affects the composition quite a bit too. So it's important to think about what kind of image you want to take and what's important to you, whether it's depth, whether it's speed, whether it's motion blur. So the last thing that controls the brightness of an image is your ISO. ISO is the sensor sensitivity to light. So ISO actually stands for International Organization of Standardization, which would be iOS. It came about in the film days when they needed to have a standardized number to let you know as a photographer how sensitive your film was going to be. So if you were going to a rock concert or to the mountains to shoot something, you knew how bright your image was going to be and not have to worry about different film stocks giving you different brightnesses. ISO is your sensor's sensitivity to light. The higher the number, the more sensitive your sensor is to light. For me, ISO is usually the last thing I'm adjusting. When I'm initially composing an image, I think about aperture and shutter speed as the most important things, and which is most important to that specific photograph. So for me, when I'm composing an image, I'm thinking about what's the most important to that specific image. Usually it's aperture or shutter speed. Say for instance, I want to take a portrait of somebody on the street, and I want them to be in focus and the rest of the background to fall off into blur. Then I'll start with aperture. I'll usually put my aperture at the lowest number, the widest opening, to get the maximum depth in my image. So when I start there, then I have my shutter speed and my ISO left to compensate to make the image properly bright. So I have my portrait, I have my person in focus and the rest of the background falling out of focus. But I don't want my shutter speed to be too slow because I don't want my subject to accidentally move a little bit and cause some motion blur. So I'd do something with my shutter speed, like maybe move it to 1/60th of a second or 1/125th. Usually if I'm photographing a person, I like to be at 1/125th or faster. So I have my aperture set at an f2.8. I have my ISO set at 1/250th of a second. And now I can evaluate my image and see if it's too bright or too dark and adjust my ISO accordingly. The one thing you have to be aware of is the higher the ISO, the more noise you get in your image. So a lot of cameras nowadays will go up to 25,000, 100,000 ISO, which is awesome. If you're shooting in a really dark space and you don't have a lot of light available, you can still capture your image. However, you're going to see a lot of noise in your image, a lot of dots, a lot of artifacts, and it's not going to be this true, clear, crisp image. So for me, I like to stay as low as I can, and usually not pass somewhere around 6400 ISO. But if you need to in the circumstance, you can definitely boost it more than that. So now you have all the information you need to shoot in manual mode. I know there's a lot of information though, so let's talk about a couple of the other modes we can shoot in. Besides auto mode and besides manual mode on your camera, there's often a program mode, a shutter priority, and an aperture priority. In aperture priority, you'll be able to choose the aperture on your camera, and then the camera will decide everything else. It'll compensate your shutter speed, and it'll choose your ISO. This is nice if you're not sure on everything, but you still want to control some aspects of your image. So in this case, the aperture. So if you know you want to have a lot of perceived depth in your image, where one thing's in focus and everything else looks out of focus, aperture priority is nice because then you can choose your aperture, something wide open, maybe at an f2, and then the camera will set everything else for you. Similarly, in shutter priority, you'll be able to set your shutter speed and the camera will figure everything else out for you. This is useful if you know you want to control the shutter, so something like sports or something fast moving, or even something slow where you know you want to have motion blur, but you don't want to have to calculate everything else. Then you can be in shutter priority, set your shutter speed, and the camera will do everything else for you. One of my favorite ways to shoot, especially if I'm walking around and I'm going to be inside and outside, or in shadow and sun, is to shoot with my aperture set the way I want it, my shutter set the way I want it, and then putting my ISO in auto mode. This still kind of relies on the little computer inside your camera to decide what's properly exposed or not, but even that can be affected a little bit. On a lot of cameras, as a dial or inside the camera in a menu setting, is something called exposure compensation. What exposure compensation does is it basically tells the computer inside your camera what you think is properly exposed. So say you're out and you have your own shutter speed, you have your own aperture, and you're in auto ISO, but all your images are still coming out too bright. What you can do is you can turn down your exposure compensation to maybe -1/3, and this will take it a stop down, and it'll show your camera where you think that neutral should be. However, ultimately I think that shooting in manual is the best. I think that having full control of your image gives you a creative edge and really allows you to choose exactly how you want your image to look. Thanks for watching. I hope this was helpful and I hope that you learned a lot. In a world that's being taken over by computers, let photography be run by you and not by the little computer inside your camera. Shoot in manual mode. Let me know what else you guys want to learn. Thanks again for watching.